We're pleased to have you here with us for the International Studies Colloquium. A lot of you know the regular protocol here, but for those of you who might be new, I see a couple new faces at least. Lunch is served throughout the program. We're very informal, so you should feel free to go up and get coffee or dessert, and we conclude promptly at 1:30. And so when you see people getting up, don't take it as some kind of affront. It's an informal atmosphere. They're actually listening quite intently. I'd like to now turn the floor over to two students here who will introduce themselves and speak about a program that's immediately following this one. So please, you have the floor. Want to come up or speak from there? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Adam Morgan.
I'm Allison Bernard.
And we're going to be hosting a little, we're the president and co-president, I don't even remember our positions, of Mid-Dialogue, which is an organization that works to get dialogue going on Middlebury campus among students, faculty, and friends. And we're going to be hosting a little dialogue after the talk. And anyone who's interested should stay around. And we're going to discuss how we feel about, I don't know, the talk and other related issues.
And we realize that it's fall break, so if you don't want to stick around, we won't be offended. But it'd be great if we could continue the discussion. So you're welcome.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. And our speaker has graciously agreed. Our speaker has graciously agreed to remain there for that informal discussion. So we'll break and end the formal program at 1:30, take maybe a 2-minute break, and then reconvene for the more informal discussion. So that's today's program, which is a rich one. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Sophie Meunier is research scholar in the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University. She's the author of multiple books, most recent Trading Voices, the European Union in International Commercial Negotiations, that came out with Princeton University Press in 2005, both in hardback and paperback. It was also published in adapted form in French. She is the co-author of The French Challenge, Adapting to Globalization, which was published by the Brookings Institution in 2001. The French adaptation of this book was the winner of the France Amérique Book Award. She is also the editor with Kathleen McNamara of Making History, European Integration and Institutional Change at 50. She is a well-known scholar, having published many, many articles on the European Union, the politics of international trade, globalization, and also French politics in journals like Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and the elusive Academic's Dream International Organization. So congratulations on winning a spot in that journal. Her current research focuses on anti-Americanism in France. But she's also interested in the ambiguous links between Europeanization and globalization and the politics of international regime complexity. She's now writing a book, I guess 2 book manuscripts, one on the politics of French anti-Americanism, which I'm sure will inform her remarks here today, and another book on the paradox of quote-unquote managed globalization. Meunier was educated at the Institut d'études politiques de Paris, and then received her PhD from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She's no stranger to Middlebury College. We're a big fan of hers, and so we've actually invited her back because we liked her so much the last time she spoke here. Her topic today is right up there. I don't need to repeat it, but do please join me in welcoming Sophie Meunier back to Middlebury College.
Well, thank you very much, Alison. Thanks, Alison. Thanks to Ed Knox also for inviting me back to Middlebury. This is actually my third visit here, so it's very exciting. And it's also exciting to be in the Rohatyn Center, which I think was not named the first time I came, because Felix Rohatyn is, of course, a big friend of Franco-American relations. I just saw him in New York a couple of weeks ago when he was hosting Bernard Kouchner, the French foreign minister, who was visiting for the UN. So it's great to be here. And as for the student dialogue afterwards, I look forward to that. And this is the time when you can for which you can save all your questions about all the juicy gossip that's happening in France and French politics right now, all the questions you might have about the Sarkozy divorce. So we'll keep them for that. I'm very well informed. So today's talk, what is anti-Americanism and the case of France? So let me start by saying, part of the reason why I chose the case of France is, well, that's what I study. But it's also because France is always thought of as the country par excellence where you see anti-Americanism at work. And, in 2003, at the time of the beginning, before the invasion, the American invasion of Iraq, American analysts and American policymakers were, of course, always pointing to France as the example of an anti-American country whose policy decisions were motivated by anti-Americanism. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. So we all know, right, that France is anti-American. I like this picture. I call it the two-headed beast. The public confrontation between France and the US over Iraq really served as a reminder that France has always seemed to be at the forefront of anti-American animosity, I should add, among America's allies. That makes a difference. And after all, what else would you expect from a country where a farmer who destroyed a McDonald's in 1999, the famous José Bové, became a national hero? Where a country where General de Gaulle, a true hero, seemed to make a point of annoying the US through his policies, from the refusal to let the UK join the European community to the decision to withdraw France from the integrated structure of NATO, thereby providing a sizable power of nuisance against the US. And a country, Chirac and Villepin, because that's obvious. And also, what else would you expect from a country where you have a dignified academy that basically serves to purge the French language from Anglo-Saxon, reading American words? So that's the image of France that we have, that France is anti-American. Of course, there's a brand new image, which is that France is pro-American as well, right? Maybe all of this, Franco-American differences over Iraq seem like they happened a long time ago. Maybe all of this has been put aside and has been forgotten now that Nicolas Sarkozy, is French president. And after all, are there many countries whose presidents spend their summer vacation in the US? Many countries whose presidents go jogging in Central Park when they're in town, in New York, or actually even go jogging at all, which is very un-French, by the way, or talk on Iran, a tougher talk than the US, thereby helping out American diplomacy and foreign policy. So has France turned a corner? Is it possible to be so deeply anti-American 1 year, or so deeply anti-American in 2003, and 4 years later to be so pro-American? What does all of this tell us about the nature of anti-Americanism in the first place? And I think it's really an interesting question to ask, because anti-Americanism is one of these phenomena that everyone talks about, everyone seems to know a lot about, and finds it very easy to recognize, right? You would know right away that you'd saw anti-Americanism. But in fact, many of the discussions and a lot of the literature that exists on anti-Americanism is very superficial. And often they're misinformed, seeing anti-Americanism when there's none, and not picking it up when it's actually there. So I'm going to take the French example through this talk and try to see whether we can look at anti-Americanism a little bit more systematically and where we can find it and how we would go about to find it. So the first obvious place to look for anti-Americanism, or to look for whether it exists or not, is to look at opinion polls. So let me do that briefly. So measuring French anti-Americanism through polls. This is a recent one, the Pew Global Attitudes, that was released in March. And this one finds that this one asked people in Europe, I did not put all the countries there, but there are a lot of countries in the poll. Asked people, do you have favorable opinion of the United States? And these are the percentages of people who say they have a favorable opinion of the United States. So, in France, you find 39% in 2006 who have a favorable opinion of the United States. But if you compare it with the other countries, you compare it with Germany, which we all know is a big fan of the United States, 37% have favorable opinions. You compare it with Spain, which after all was part of the coalition of the willing, And there, only 23% of the population currently has a favorable opinion of the United States. And of course, it's obvious that the negative opinions, or that the positive opinions went strikingly down after 2003. So, it doesn't seem, when I look at this poll, it doesn't strike me that the French are so much more anti-American than the other Europeans. That's not completely true over time. If you look at polling data from the time after the Second World War until now, you find a different picture, with the French having been more systematically more critical of the US than most other European public. And even though French sentiments towards the United States have been over time, mostly positive. This is, again, a recent evolution. You only find Spain and Greece consistently, which have been more negative towards the US than France. Now, a second poll, it was in the part of the same poll. Another question they asked was whether people had favorable opinions of Americans, not of the United States, but of Americans. There you find, again, consistently numbers which are much higher. People have a much more favorable opinion of the Americans as individuals than they do of the US as a country and its policies. But, it's the same story. You have 65% of the French who have a favorable opinion of the United States, of the Americans, sorry. And it seems pretty similar to Germany. It's not that far off from the UK. And it's certainly much more than in Spain. So again, this is not a picture where we see the French standing out in their anti-Americanism. So let me end with yet another poll, this one was taken by the German Marshall Fund. And the question they asked was about the desirability of strong US leadership in world affairs. And the questions were, how is US leadership in world affairs? Very desirable, somewhat desirable. So here you find, indeed, the French who do have a quite negative view of the US leadership role in world affairs. There's only 28% who find it either very desirable or somewhat desirable. And this is not the same in the UK, even in Germany, it's stronger. But again, if you compare it with Spain or even with Italy, it doesn't seem. Again, I don't see in any of these three pictures I showed you French anti-Americanism just standing out from the numbers. And yet, right, we all know that the French are anti-American. So how would we go about finding it? What makes them anti-American if you don't capture that in the polls? So that's the puzzle. The two questions I'm going to ask. How do we recognize anti-Americanism? And why does French anti-Americanism stand out if it's not in the numbers? And I'm going to get three reasons for that today, which is first that there's a deep reservoir of anti-American arguments in France that doesn't exist in other countries, that there's the simultaneous coexistence of all types of anti-Americanism, and I'm going to explain that. And finally, I'll go quickly on the political argument. There's also a political argument for that. So let me start with the definition about what is anti-Americanism. And in order to help with the definition, I'm going to base it on a book which came out last year, Anti-Americanisms in World Politics. Actually, I do take the responsibility for the S at the end of this book. That was edited by Peter Katzenstein, my colleague Bob Cohen, and I was lucky enough to be part of the project and to write the chapter on France, and where we all try collectively to be a little bit more systematic about anti-Americanism. So, is the current set of attitudes, negative attitudes toward the US, a reaction against the Bush administration and its policies? That could be a definition. Or does it result from more profound feelings? Is this the result of recent changes in the structure of world politics since the end of the Cold War, the hyperpower of the United States, or shifts in public attitudes for a variety of reasons that are driving the US and France apart? And how do we know anti-Americanism when we see it? So what we do in the book is to define anti-Americanism as an unfavorable predisposition. Predisposition really is the key word here, towards the United States, which then leads individuals to interpret American actions through their pre-existing views. And again, pre-existing, like predisposition, those are the key. and negative stereotypes irrespective of the facts. So it's really based on a belief that there's something that's fundamentally wrong at the essence of what is America. And that's quite different from saying that the policies of the Bush administration in Iraq are fundamentally wrong. That does not make you, in our definition, an anti-American. And after all, people who think that the Bush's policies towards Iraq are wrong are found in the US as well, and they can be very patriotic. It doesn't make them anti-American. So why should it make the French anti-American? Biased people are more likely to attribute bad policies to the essence of the US. No, it's no wonder that Bush made this bad policy on Iraq, because he's from the US, and we all know that the US is wrong, right? That's anti-American, rather than specific policies. And then people who are biased that way tend to discount potentially favorable information. There are great things about the US, but they wouldn't think about those because it doesn't fit in their beliefs. So consciously or unconsciously, actually, and that goes back to the previous poll that I showed you, individuals themselves often disaggregate Americanism and thereby anti-Americanism into three categories. There's the United States is the first, like in the first question that was asked in the poll. And that basically means Washington and especially the whole foreign policy of the country. So when people are asked, what do you think about the US, they think about what do you think about American foreign policy very often. There's a second dimension, which is America. And that would be a little bit different from the United States. And that would capture more the economy, the society, the culture of the country. And finally, there's Americans as individuals. And as we saw in the polls, the numbers are quite strikingly different, even though over time you've seen the numbers narrow between what people think about the US and its policies and what people think about Americans as individuals, especially after the 2004 re-election of President Bush. You saw that gap start to close, to narrow considerably, because in a way people were giving Americans the benefit of the doubt before, and they were saying, well, Bush wasn't elected anyway in the first place, but if he gets re-elected the second time, then maybe you won't give credit the second time, and maybe it does reflect. So it's narrowing down. But still, there's still a pretty big gap between what people think about the US and what people think about America. And finally, anti-Americanism should not be confused with mere opposition to the United States. Being critical of US policy on a given subject does not automatically qualify someone or an actor, be it a state or an individual, as anti-American. And as I said before, even American citizens can legitimately oppose their government while remaining faithful to the nation. So, again, the anti-Americanism, the definition is when it stems from a wish to embarrass the US and a very visceral dislike of anything that's American rather than just a conflict of interest. So is France, according to this definition, anti-American? It's the problem. We try to be systematic in the book, and we looked at other cases as well, but the problem is it's very difficult in practice to distinguish between genuine anti-Americanism, and that's the predisposition, and genuine criticism of the United States, which is just an opinion. It's very hard to do in practice. And it's partly because of this definitional ambiguity that France appears more anti-American than its European partners. It's not clear that the French have a stronger negative predisposition towards the US, but they have stronger opinions about America, and they're usually pretty good and pretty excited about voicing these opinions loudly. So that makes them, I think, that makes them appear more anti-American. But I'm going to explore three main reasons, I think, why French anti-Americanism stands out. The first one is a historical explanation, and that's really the length of the history of French anti-Americanism, and the fact that France is really the country with the deepest and the most sedimented reservoir of anti-American arguments. So sure, we all know France is the only big European power that actually has never fought a war against the United States. But the French distrust of America is as old as, if not older than the country of the United States itself. It really began as an extension of the centuries-old antagonism between France and England at the time, and I'm reminded of that all the time in Vermont, of the time that France was an American power. And what's interesting is that then each period in the long relationship between France and the US has seen the development of new sets of anti-American arguments. I'm not going to go through them, but I've listed a couple here. Even prior to the formation of the US, you had arguments that were developed by French philosophers and writers about American inferiority and French content. Then during the revolutionary period, you had arguments about provincialism, individualism, the US being self-serving, hypocritical. And the same is true for basically each stage in the history between the two countries, with new arguments that are being developed. Over time, these arguments, they don't go away. They just accumulate. They accumulate into a vast repertoire of cliches and negative stereotypes. I know sometimes with my students, I compare that to like a big box or a big hutch where they're being stored. And they're just being stored one on top of the other. But what's interesting is that, when there's no crisis, you just put the lid on the box. But every time there's a crisis, these arguments are there. They are available in the background of French national consciousness. And each time there's a crisis, these arguments do bleed. Well, you open the box, they come out, and they're there. You just need to adapt them to the current situation. But that's really what I found to be striking in 2003. And the same is true, by the way, for American arguments against France. One thing that really struck me is how outdated some of them were and why they always made references to how the French behaved in World War II, or that they were cowards or things like that. I think it's really this process by which you just keep the old arguments and you just open them and use them. So as a result, each time the occasion of criticizing the US would arise in France, opinion makers could use the arguments and just adapt them au goût du jour. So I think that's the first explanation. What makes France special, in a way, is that it just has a longer history, and a longer history of accumulating these negative arguments. The second reason why French anti-Americanism stands out has to do with the breadth of the varieties of anti-Americanisms that exist. And let me explain a little bit. Not all anti-Americanisms are the same, which is why we call that book that I see Ed has right here, Anti-Americanisms in World Politics. And in that book, Peter Katzenstein, Bob Cohen, and all the contributors, we developed a typology, actually, of all the different types of anti-Americanism that exists. And we basically found 6 different types of anti-Americanism. I'll go through them very soon. Usually you find that the anti-American critiques in most countries are concentrated in 2, 3, or maybe 4 of these types. But what's peculiar about France is that all the possible types that we could find in the book are present in the French case. And indeed, I even had to argue, if you read the volume carefully, you'll see that I even added a 7th one that was not, collective. I just kept saying, but in France you have also that type of anti-Americanism and this type. So briefly, and these types, I should add, are not mutually exclusive. So it's not because you're type 2 or type 3, which you'll see, that you cannot also be anti-American in another way. So one individual group may feed his or her anti-Americanism simultaneously from several sources. But that does not suggest either that if you're sharing one type of anti-American argument, you're necessarily anti-American all across the board. So briefly, now the suspense is over. Here's what the different types are. The first one, it's an awful word, but it's actually saying souverainiste in French. The sovereignist anti-Americanism. A frequent French critique of the US, which is often associated with Gaullism, focuses on the power of the US in the international system. And on the right, as on the left, you have many politicians who have insisted on the importance of not losing control over your country's sovereignty and destiny, even if sometimes it means getting in the way of the United States. And that particular type of anti-Americanism is rooted in a sensitive national ego, and maybe some say a particular bitterness about the loss of great power status. So that's the first type, sovereignists. That's the one that it has nothing to do with American culture, American society, American policies. It's just that the US is very strong in the world system and tends to dictate everything. A second type, they're in no special order. A second type is the one we call the legacy anti-Americanism. That comes from the legacy of relationship between the two countries in question. So in the French case, it comes from the legacy of a sometimes tense Franco-American history, not the nice part of the relationship, but the tense part, such as, for instance, what was perceived in France as the late involvement of the US in the Second World War, or Dien Bien Phu, or Suez, that type of history, as well as from the legacy of the communist influence during the Cold War era in France. So the idea is that what the US did in the past, in addition to what the US is doing today, suggests that it's a partner that just cannot be trusted, and thus France needs to take national security into its own hands instead of being at the mercy of the vagaries of American foreign policy. And for instance, that means, well, that France should contribute to building a strong European defense and security policy. The third type of anti-Americanism, completely unrelated to the others, is the one we call liberal. And that's the idea that America has great ideas, great values, but the problem is it's not living it up to its own principles, and it's demanding of others virtues that it does not uphold itself. So you're basically criticizing the US, not the values that it has, but using US values to criticize the US. And because of this hypocrisy, the idea is that the US is becoming a danger to the very cause that it pretends to be promoting. You know, I don't need to explain, you know, like democracy and freedom and all of that. And whether it's with respect to free trade or the environment or the Middle East. Another type, so again, you know, you find all these three types in France. A fourth type, which is particularly French, which really we find more in France than in the other countries that we studied in the book, is the elitist type of anti-Americanism. And that's driven mostly by cultural arguments instead of policy actions. And that's really the oldest and the most visible form of anti-Americanism in France. And it is patronizing elitist critique of America, a feeling of French superiority over the United States, which is well ingrained in France. And ironically, it's well ingrained even in those who have wholeheartedly adopted American culture, popular culture. A fifth one, which is actually the one I added to the volume, is nostalgic anti-Americanism. And it's when people have negative sentiments about what they perceived American culture and society to have done to France, and believing that France was just a better place before the United States, and before its fig leaf globalization transformed it, dehumanized it, and cut it off from its traditional roots. And whether we're talking about the cafe on the corner, or the wines, or even the French language. And that's a very defensive type of anti-Americanism, one that calls for protectionist action. A sixth one is the social anti-Americanism. Nothing to do with foreign policy, nothing to do with the role of the US in the world structure. That's one of the most prevalent and widespread denunciations of America in France. And it focuses on the social order in the United States, or what is perceived to be the social order, because actually a lot of them are inaccurate in their perceptions. And this social critique has three main components: that America is a fundamentally unequal society, that America is a violent and hypocritical society. We talk about abortion, but you have death penalty and guns, etc. And third, that America is an excessively religious society. And finally, the seventh type, which you find in France too, even though, again, it has nothing to do with the other ones, is the radical Muslim anti-Americanism. Comes from some religiously radicalized French Muslims who really partake in this whole clash of civilization idea. and believe that the US is involved in a crusade against Muslims in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Palestine. And of all the anti-Americanisms that you find in France, that's the only one that actually calls for actual violence against the American people and against the United States. So again, that was the second reason why I think French anti-Americanism stand out. It's just that all of them are present in a way or another in French society. The third reason is political. What's peculiar about France is how in the past 3 decades, anti-Americanism has been spread out all across the domestic political spectrum, whereas in most other European countries, at least I'm comparing only with Europe, you had parties and politicians that were anti-American, but then on the other side, you had parties that were pro-American. And it would be costly for you to be anti-American because that could be held against you. But in France, you don't find that. And that's what's peculiar. There was obviously an anti-Americanism of the left, a remnant of communism and the Cold War. And that's, in the communist and the far left. And obviously, there was an anti-Americanism of the far right, as you would expect, that's based mostly on nostalgia and on fears about national identity and sovereignty. But there's also an anti-Americanism of the moderate left, which is based mostly on social issues and disagreements related to globalization. And you also have an anti-Americanism of the mainstream right, which is really unusual, mostly the heir of Gaullism. So anti-Americanism has been able to endure in France because the costs associated with using anti-American rhetoric have been far smaller than the benefits that you can derive from it, which again is not the case in most other European countries. French politicians have had until recently, until Sarkozy basically, few incentives to defend the US or criticize people who make anti-American pronouncements. But at the same time, it's hard to mobilize anti-Americanism as a political resource to support an agenda since everybody shares the view. I'd rather keep time for questions, so I'm going to skip what I was going to say about the political users of anti-Americanism, but I can go back to this later. So now, that brings me to Sarkozy and French anti-Americanism. Isn't that nice? His wife wasn't there. She didn't show up for that lunch. She was sick. So that brings us to Sarkozy and the very visible inflection of the new French administration on everything American. So far, Sarkozy, the American, as he's being called in France, has kept true to his reputation. He has tried to operate a foreign policy rapprochement with the US directly, personally, not through the usual diplomatic channels, as was evidenced by his American vacation. The new position of the French administration on Iran, as well as hints that France might want to reintegrate fully NATO and might want to help out in Iraq, which was completely unheard of until basically last week, are clear signs that French foreign policy is not motivated at the moment by anti-Americanism. And for now, what I found interesting watching French politics is that Sarkozy's overtures and open activist policy towards the US has not been too heavily criticized in France at home. Certainly less than you could have expected given France's history of real or perceived anti-Americanism. So part of that may be due to the fact that we are now at a particular historical juncture, and now may seem a very logical time for rapprochement, Sarkozy or no Sarkozy. Now, on the one hand, you have President Bush, who has been seriously weakened, both domestically and internationally, and is on the way out, though the French, like the rest of the world, really sees him as a lame duck president. The US being less strong and less credible, it might be an opportune time for Europeans and read French leaders to step in. On the other hand, you have President Sarkozy, who's on the way in, with both his domestic opposition and the international community giving him really the benefit of the doubt and a very long honeymoon. But this favorable historical juncture can change if Sarkozy stops being perceived as successful at home, which might be starting as we speak, and if you have a new momentum that emerges with next year's election in the US. But I think part of the reason why people have not given him too much of a hard time for being openly pro-American may also be due to the fact that Sarkozy may have tapped into a new generation, the 30-somethings, for whom the US represents social and cultural and economic, especially dynamism, and for whom the anti-American social wars, about poverty and death penalty and religiosity, are really less important than they were for the '68 generation. So this attempted rehabilitation of the US in the French collective psyche goes way beyond foreign policy, and that's what's, I think, really interesting about it. And it's deeply, fundamentally about domestic politics as well. For Sarkozy, everyone knows the history, right? Sarkozy, the immigrant and the non-graduate of the French elite schools. The best things about the US are the can-do attitude, that you can succeed even if you're a son of an immigrant, even if you didn't go to the best schools. And he really hopes and talks very highly about this hope of social promotion through hard work and praise for success. And by reconciling France and the US in foreign policy, what Sarkozy is trying to do, less visibly maybe, is really to reconcile the idea, and it's a novel idea in a way, that there are indeed some aspects, to reconcile the French with the idea that there are some aspects of American public policy which may well be worth importing, whether we're talking about affirmative action or the reform of the justice system, whether we're talking about multiculturalism or the spoils system in the administration. Sarkozy is really attempting a serious revolution in French policymaking and thinking, and that is simply to show that the fact that a policy is American does not discredit it per se, which was not true in previous years and previous governments. So all of this should bode well for the US and I guess for American foreign policy, right? Well, I'm not so sure. I wouldn't be so positive because I am not so sure that there is such a strong link, after all, between the state of anti-American feelings in France and an anti-American French foreign policy. And it's not even clear that French anti-Americanism has had any impact on the US at all. So let me now turn to the next slide. This is an actual picture of a Starbucks coffee outlet in Paris.
So they changed the graphic a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know why it doesn't go anywhere. Oh.
Slightly different.
Oops. Sorry. Okay. So take the Iraq case, for instance, which has been portrayed in the US media as the case par excellence of French foreign policy, which was motivated by anti-Americanism. I looked at it in this book, and I'm looking at it in the book I'm writing right now, and really the argument does not hold up under close scrutiny. Anti-Americanism was really secondary in guiding French foreign policy in this case. Instead, it was motivated by many, many other things, especially a different comprehension of the situation and a different understanding of what would best defend national interests. And interestingly, only a fraction, if you take Iraq aside, there's really a tiny, tiny fraction of French foreign policy action in the past decade which appear confrontational towards the US. And even when, at the same time as the French were embroiled in this very bitter public battle with the US over Iraq, they were simultaneously cooperating on Afghanistan and then in Lebanon and on all counterterrorism issues. So to me, that doesn't say that French foreign policy is motivated by anti-Americanism. And indeed, Franco-American cooperation on intelligence and counterterrorism has never been better than in the month that actually immediately followed the US invasion of Iraq and the battle and the dispute between France and the US. What's interesting also, and that's why I put the picture of Starbucks there, is that there has been no impact either on the economy. No, we have all this manifestation of French anti-Americanism, no impact on the Franco-American economic relationship. So sure, there have been very public calls for consumer boycotts on both sides of the Atlantic. And I just conducted a study with a colleague of mine from Princeton on the economic impact of political tensions between France and the US over Iraq on the economic relationship. And really beyond anecdotes, we could not find any hard evidence that French people who were prejudiced against the US stopped consuming American products as a way of demonstrating their hostility, and vice versa. No, the same did not happen in the US either. We all remember these pictures of French wine being dumped down the drain, etc., but there were no consequences. It didn't last for long at all. On the contrary, and this is where it really becomes interesting and ironic, economic relations between France and the US have never been better. And it's indeed quite striking how similar has been the evolution of American trade with France and American trade with the UK during the same time period, in spite of their divergent positions on Iraq. And the trade figures since 2003 absolutely do not mimic the political coalitions that formed at the time of the Iraq invasion. Even more ironically, US trade increased less with Spain and Italy during that time, where, as we know, members of the coalition of the willing, than it did with Germany and France, who were the backstabbers from old Europe. And American businesses really seem to be flourishing in France, from Gap to Starbucks, which I don't know whether any of you know now how many outlets they have in Paris. They now have 29 Starbucks in Paris. And then they just started opening 3 years ago, after the Iraq invasion. And most ironically, it's with McDonald's, I think, that the paradox is the greatest. Of all the European countries, it's in France that McDonald's has been performing the best over the past 3 years. And for those of you who are still, by the way, I should add, boycotting French products after 2003, maybe you're not aware that Bill O'Reilly of Fox News, who's the one who actually launched the whole Boycott France campaign, officially lifted the boycott on May 7th of this year, the day after the election of Sarkozy. He's still selling the Boycott France stickers on his website, but the boycott is officially over. So now you can go back to buying your French products. So overall, I think this whole background anti-Americanism, that is there. I showed you it's there, and I explained why it's there. But I think it does not have any consequences on the US. It has not produced openly confrontational policies, contrary to what people commonly believe. And neither has it produced stronger support for deeper European integration, which you could have expected would happen, which then would have enabled France to stand up more forcefully against the US when needed. And as the very divisive debate in France over the European referendum in 2005 showed, anti-Americanism really did not seem to be weighing in much on people's mind. So I'm not sure that the current favorable predisposition of the Sarkozy administration to the US will make any differences either. Because when the administration seems to be anti-American, it doesn't affect the US. And I'm not sure when it's pro, it's going to affect it either. So let me now turn to my conclusion. This is Bernard Kouchner, who's the French foreign minister. So to conclude, when we're talking, it's gray, sorry, hope you can read. When we're talking about anti-Americanism, we really must take care to distinguish between what are temporary feelings of discontent, which are generated by specific policy actions, and true bias, in spite or even beyond specific policy actions. And by these standards, French anti-Americanism does exist. There is. I'm not saying there is no French anti-Americanism. There is. The complex relationship of the French with the US is made of older and more profound feelings than simply a temporary negative reaction towards the Bush administration and its policies, one that could be very easily reversed, or just by a president who just decides he's so pro-American, he's wearing American T-shirts everywhere and vacations there. It's deeper than that. So the bad news is French anti-Americanism is not a thing of the past, despite Sarkozy's PR efforts. But the good news is, as you guessed from the talk, I don't think it really matters anyway. The common corpus of anti-Americanism in France has spread out into at least these 7 types of anti-American arguments I was laying out before. But that French society would nurture, at the same time, all these types does not imply to paraphrase Le Monde's famous headline on September 12, 2001, it doesn't imply that we are all anti-Americans. Because for all these manifestations of anti-Americanism in France, there are daily manifestations of pro-anti-Americanism, even if they don't make it to the newspapers. You know, in the world of business, for instance, which really admires and imports a lot of American methods of management. Obviously, in the world of higher education, which really envies and aspires to American-style universities, in the world of entertainment, and even in the world of food, where French chefs are now looking at what's happening here in awe and really want to copy things that are being done here. So in a way, the French are all Americans, and they've integrated this into their daily lives. So now let me, just to conclude, I just wanted to say that, after all, if there's one thing that really does approach a national character in France, it would be simply that the French are anti. They're anti-everything. They're anti-Europe, they're anti their own government, they demonstrate, they go on strike all the time, they're anti the bosses, they're anti, the immigrants, they're anti-Americans. So my last word will be just don't take it too personally. Thank you.
It was a wonderful talk. The floor is now open for questions. Who'd like to begin?
A comment or two about the history of this relationship, and then the question. I agree that I think much of it comes out of the English-French relationship that was much more historical. Mm-hmm. And you see it in France with this constant reference to Anglo-Saxons, when what they mean is Americans, basically, and the English following the American lead. And I think you see it on the American side with somehow the sense historically, which may be changing now, historically, that France has some sort of pride of place. France matters intellectually and culturally in a way that other countries don't. I think that's partly a question of what language people are studying in school, at least the ones who study language. But I think there is this, which was situated in the observer rather than the observed. That is, that Americans are a little bit more concerned about criticism from the French than they might be from some other countries. But it seems to me there's a big difference. French bashing here tends to cast France as though it were a person. In other words, France's unacceptable behavior is petulant, disloyal, a lot of personal traits, whereas the French, I think, see America in systemic terms. Capitalism, multiculturalism, this sort of thing. And my question was, could you say a little bit about the extent to which America stands in for the French in place of modernization, progress in quotes, this globalization, that sort of thing? Because I think that's also a dimension of at least criticism of the States. I'm not sure whether it's part of anti-Americanism.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an interesting question. Of course, you've written yourself a lot about the French bashing and how they see us. What's interesting is that at the end of the 1990s, I just showed you the polls since 2000, basically, but it was a little cheating because anti-Americanism, at least as captured by the polls, started to rise in France in the 1990s, when it was completely flat in the other European countries. So when you look at the numbers today, they look similar, but the evolution has not been the same. And the reason why it rose in France in the 1990s was that the French were completely obsessed with globalization. And for them, globalization and Americanization were the same thing. It was the same thing. They really equated the two at the time. So they took this jump start on anti-Americanism. And when the Iraq crisis hit, it hit the French when they were already pretty high on the curve of having negative sentiments towards the US. The other countries caught up after that, but for other reasons that really had to do with foreign policy. And that anti-Americanism was deeper. Because as you were saying, it was really about the US and capitalism, the US traits of the US, not a specific policy, really what the US was all about. What's interesting today is that this has changed. And the French, I think, in a way, woke up. I mean, they're still obsessed with globalization. They're still very fearful. Other Europeans are fearful too, which they were not in the 90s. Americans are very fearful too. And what's happening today is that they start to realize that globalization and Americanization are no longer the same thing. And the real threats from globalization today are not coming from the US. It's not coming from the US. It's really coming from China. And in a way, on the issue of globalization, Europe, France, and the US are in the same boat. So this has changed, and this has been a very recent change. I mean, up until a couple of years ago, French were still using all these slogans about the US and globalization and American multinational companies doing all these evil things, which basically doesn't exist anymore and has no more audience today.
Do you want to call on? Go ahead and call on.
Sure. Would you mind just giving me a name so I know?
David Rosenberg.
You speak like an answering machine.
I have a question about a phrase you used at the very beginning. You said something about the American invasion of Iraq. So I just wonder about the word, your use of the word invasion. Is that intentional or accidental or casual? Does it have a message to it? Is it French?
Well,
Can you explain that perhaps?
well, how else would you call it?
You very rarely see that in the New York Times.
Well, I'll see that in the French papers all the time. But
Intervention, perhaps. Well, I watch it very closely. I must say I was a little surprised. There are many ways you could characterize
okay,
it.
well.
Invasion is a little bit, occupation is more...
Intervention followed by occupation?
Yes,
Yeah, well.
occupation.
Okay.
So, yes, you could use all of those, but I'm asking you...
Okay, so let's say I'm using the way it's described in the French media. And I think in a lot of media around the world, maybe except here.
Do you find yourself identifying with or relating to the types of anti-Americanism that you describe in your lecture? And if so, which ones?
Can you repeat that? I couldn't hear
Do you
you.
find yourself relating to
You mean a personal question? Oh, I should go back to my types. Okay, let's see.
which one?
Okay. You mean living in France or just before I moved here?
Well, you noted that even the French who have immersed themselves into American society still feel some of the ones. So I'm just curious as to which ones do you, if so, if any.
I think like many Europeans and maybe like some Americans, I really feel strongly for the liberal type, which is that in a way US values are wonderful, but the US is not doing a big service to its own values through some of its policies. And it's not only in Iraq, because I studied, as Alison mentioned before, I come really from the field of trade and trade policy. And I've seen that happen many times in the case of trade, where the US is really the defender of free trade values, etc. And then you have so many policy actions over the year where the US is not doing what it preaches and wants others to do, that it starts to accumulate and become a threat. So if I'm guilty of one of those types of anti-Americanism, I think it would be the one. For the others, well, I'm not a radical Muslim, and for the social part, I think when I lived in France, actually, I had some of these negative predispositions based on the social, and even here, there's still some social aspects of the United States I don't like, but I certainly do not condemn the US as a whole based on some of these aspects. There's so many French aspects of French society I criticize as well, so.
Would you say that French Americanism is also an idea that's sort of cultivated in the US as well? And we put this label up on them as being anti-Americanism, that sort of affects our relationship with them. Also the fact that they are anti-American. The way you described it as it not being like such a big deal, but I'm wondering if you think that America makes it that big a deal.
It's both. So the Americans certainly contribute. I mean, the American analysts and the media do contribute to perpetuating that idea that the French are so much more anti-Americans than the others. In the year that followed, the intervention in Iraq followed by the occupation that still is going on, there are a slew of books that came out in the US that were about I mean, there were really nasty books about French anti-Americanism with horrible and sometimes really funny titles, like, you know, Our Oldest Enemy, The French Betrayal of America, my favorite one, which is Vile France, Cowardice and Cheese, something like that. So all these books, and the fact that many of very public figures like Bill O'Reilly or what, you know, some of the US congressmen did with the Freedom Fries really helped to ingrain that idea that the French were more anti-American. But it's not only the Americans' fault. First of all, because objectively there is some anti-Americanism in France, but also I think the French, in a way, like to take the lead and like to be cast in that way, because it gives France some power. If you look again at the time just before the U.S. intervention in Iraq, just in a couple of months, January, February 2003, Germany was doing. Germany's position was no more different than France, but nobody here basically criticized Germany or said how anti-American all the Germans were, because France was happy to just take the lead and being cast in the role of a villain, and taking the fight very publicly. So again, to answer, the U.S. is responsible to some extent, but not completely.
A comment and then a question. The comment is, don't you think it hurts, but it's a question too, don't you think it hurts us more that the French take this lead for being anti-American, because actually we nurture a special place in our hearts for the French, probably after the English. The French are the people in Europe we feel closest to, and related to that, have the tourism statistics. Do you have access to the tourism statistics? And how have they changed over that same period that you were dealing with, in both directions? Are we going to Paris less than we used to? And are the French coming here with the wonderful dollar that they had on sale for the last year?
Yep. So, two great questions. The first one, does it hurt us, the U.S., more than the French take the lead? To answer maybe a little bit differently, I really think it does not matter much, as I tried to say in the talk. There have been consequences of French anti-Americanism, which I did not go over. But I think the true consequences of French anti-Americanism have not been on the US. They've been on France itself. Because what anti-Americanism in France has done is to basically prevent the French, up until now, it may change, to import a lot of policies which may have helped the French to fix some of their own domestic problems. Whether we're talking about the economy or the integration of immigrants, there's such a whole variety of policies in which it might have been useful to import some policies from elsewhere. So in France, it's okay to import some policies from Scandinavia, for instance, but it's completely not okay to import policies from the US, because we all know that the US is an unjust, unequal society, racist, blah, blah, blah. So every time someone tried to give an answer to a solution that closely resembled an American policy, the opponent of the reform only had to say, but that's an American policy, and then end of discussion. So I think that's why, that's really what I'm arguing in this book I'm writing, is that the main consequence has been on France itself. And that's why I was insisting in the talk that I think the revolution that Sarkozy is doing is not the one we think he's doing when we read the press, which is a big French foreign policy revolution, Atlantis, return to Atlanticism. I don't think that's the one. I think the real one is trying finally to say that it's no longer taboo to talk about a solution that's American. So that's, in a way, the answer to your first question. Answer to your second question, tourism is actually basically the only the only sector of the economy where you do find an impact. But it was a very temporary impact. It did not last long. We looked at everything else. We looked in aggregate, trade aggregate, no impact. We looked at specific sectors, so we looked at blue cheese, we looked at wines, we looked at leather handbags and leather luggage, and we looked at perfumes and cosmetics, and basically, except for tourism, and we looked at tourism. And you don't find in any of the sectors. Wine was the one that people thought was the hardest hit. And actually it was hit at basically 6 weeks after the US intervention in March. That's when you find some real impact. But basically, after a couple more weeks, it was completely back to normal, and it's as if nothing had happened. So very, very limited impact. Tourism, a little bit of cancellations on both sides, in both directions. But it's not clear whether it was really in protest or just because people were worried that something might happen, and then it slowly went back to, Americans started going back to France, even though the dollar is like basically, monkey currency right now. But, yeah, obviously the French are coming in droves to the US, so, wow, so many hands.
I have just to follow up on this, on the statistical questions you indicated, these Pew results, and I'm wondering whether these are blunt instruments or whether they discriminate among elites and different segments of populations in these places, because obviously the kind of anti-Americanism you're talking about might track according to how people were situated in social terms.
Yeah, they do. I mean, they're very great surveys. I mean, they're very thick. They're like 100. Both the German Marshall Fund and the Pew have been going on for several years now, so it gives us some comparisons. They didn't exist before, so it's hard to find data. The data on anti-Americanism before was very random. You had one survey here, one survey there every now and then. But basically, since 2001, both the Pew and the German Marshall Fund are asking same questions with regularity and a lot of questions, and it does. I just gave you some big results, but it does try to distinguish between all of this. The main difference is usually with respect to the leadership of the U.S., specific policy questions, but mostly about the leadership role of the U.S. in the world, where you found elites in the past, French elites, being really more upset about the U.S. role in the world versus the more general mass public. But the differences are not huge, and especially on culture, this is what's really surprising. Is this elitist, as I was saying, this elitist discourse you find everywhere, even though, the French have adopted American culture as everybody else, so.
This conversation is actually just
promptly ending.
heating up, but we're unfortunately out of time. However, please, I encourage you to come up and ask questions informally and stay on for the discussion that's following. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for